Leon stood amidst the dazzling lights and elegant chatter of a grand charity gala, a world where he felt both at home and out of place. Despite his immense wealth, Leon had never embraced the airs and graces expected in high society. He preferred his simple tailored suits to ostentatious displays of affluence, and his interest in helping others far outweighed his interest in keeping up appearances. It was at this gala, however, that his life would change forever as he spotted Isabella from across the room. She was radiant in a crimson gown, her eyes sparkling with warmth and intelligence as she conversed effortlessly with everyone around her. Isabella was the daughter of Victor and Clarissa Harrington, a family deeply entrenched in the upper echelons of society. Yet Leon saw something different in her. She wasn't like the others. Her laughter was genuine, and her conversations carried a sincerity that was rare in such circles. Drawn to her, he mustered the courage to approach, and they quickly discovered a shared passion for charity work. Over the course of that evening, they found themselves immersed in conversation, discussing everything from their dreams of making the world a better place to their love of quiet moments away from the chaos of city life. Leon felt an immediate connection with Isabella, and it was clear she felt the same. It wasn't just her beauty that captivated him, it was her intelligence, compassion, and the way she spoke about wanting to leave a real mark on the world. As the night came to an end, Leon asked Isabella if he could see her again, to which she shyly agreed. Their relationship blossomed over the coming months, and Leon's admiration for Isabella only grew. She was everything he had ever wanted: kind-hearted, fiercely intelligent, and unpretentious despite her background. However, every time the topic of meeting her family came up, Isabella hesitated. "It's not that I'm ashamed," she would say. "It's just, they're not like you, Leon. They care so much about image, about status. I don't want them to judge you before they know who you really are." Leon assured her that it didn't matter, that he was willing to face whatever came his way because he loved her. But deep down, he understood her concerns. The Harringtons had a reputation for being formidable, and they had always expected their daughter to marry someone with an equally impeccable pedigree. It wasn't about love or compatibility for them. It was about maintaining their status in the social hierarchy. Leon prepared himself for the worst, but nothing could have braced him for the darkness he would soon uncover. The fateful meeting with Isabella's parents finally took place in a high-end restaurant. Leon arrived early, nervous but hopeful, dressed in his best suit. As he waited, he noticed the arrival of Victor and Clarissa, Isabella's parents. Their eyes glanced over him with fleeting disinterest, assuming he was simply another member of the waitstaff. Leon's heart sank when they impatiently handed him their coats without a second glance. He didn't correct them, opting to avoid an awkward confrontation in that moment, but he saw the flicker of distress in Isabella's eyes as she approached and introduced him as her fiancé. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, and Clarissa's lips tightened into a polite yet dismissive smile. Throughout the evening, they spoke to Leon with a veneer of politeness that barely concealed their judgment. They inquired about his family background, his education, and his business ventures, their questions laced with condescension. But Leon answered calmly, refusing to rise to their bait. He noticed how Isabella grew increasingly uncomfortable, squeezing his hand under the table as if to reassure him that she was on his side. The tension grew more palpable when Victor invited them to dinner at their mansion the following weekend. Despite the uncomfortable evening, Leon agreed, eager to make an effort for Isabella's sake. That night, he promised her that no matter what happened, he would always be by her side. "I'll prove to them that I'm worthy of you," he vowed, and Isabella kissed him, whispering, that he had nothing to prove. The following Saturday, Leon arrived at the Harrington mansion, a sprawling estate that exuded wealth and power. As the evening progressed, he excused himself to use the restroom and inadvertently wandered into Victor's private study. There, amidst the shelves of leather-bound books and luxurious furnishings, something caught his eye: a stack of documents carelessly left on the desk. Curiosity got the better of him, and he approached, intending only to glance at them. But what he saw made his blood run cold. The papers detailed transactions, wire transfers, and shipments of people. The unmistakable signs of human trafficking. Leon's heart raced as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. Stunned and horrified, he quickly took out his phone and snapped photos of the documents, knowing that no one would believe him without evidence. He returned to the dinner table, his mind swirling with the implications of what he had just discovered. As he watched Victor and Clarissa interact with their guests, it was all he could do to keep his composure. How could these people, who seemed so refined and elegant, be involved in something so monstrous? In the days that followed, Leon threw himself into investigating the Harringtons' dealings, piecing together a disturbing puzzle. He discovered that Victor and Clarissa ran a network disguised as a legitimate elite networking business, which in reality was a front for a far more sinister operation. They were involved in the trafficking of people, exploiting the vulnerable for profit. The more Leon dug, the more disgusted he became. But he knew he had to be careful. The Harringtons were powerful, with connections that reached far and wide. Any wrong move could endanger not just him, but Isabella as well. He shared his findings with Isabella, who was initially in disbelief. "No," she said, shaking her head. "There must be some mistake. My parents, they've always been strict and demanding, but they would never do something like this." But as Leon laid out the evidence, she grew silent, her face pale with shock. It took her hours to fully process what she had learned, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "We have to stop them," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "We can't let them hurt anyone else." Leon knew they had to act, but he also knew they needed to be smart about it. They couldn't confront Victor and Clarissa directly, not yet. Instead, Leon continued gathering evidence, determined to expose them. He spent sleepless nights combing through documents, emails, and financial records, compiling an irrefutable case against them. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized how dangerous this mission truly was. One evening, as he was collecting more evidence at a location linked to the Harringtons, he heard the click of a gun behind him. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," a voice snarled. And Leon turned to find Victor standing there, a cold, predatory smile on his face. "You should have stayed in your lane, boy." Leon was captured and brought to a remote warehouse where Victor and Clarissa confronted him. "Did you really think you could outsmart us?" Clarissa sneered, her eyes glinting with malice. "You're nothing but a distraction, an inconvenience. But now you'll learn what happens to those who threaten our family." As they prepared to deal with Leon once and for all, Isabella made a desperate decision. Having overheard her father's plans, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She contacted the authorities, armed with the evidence Leon had gathered, and guided them to the warehouse. As the police stormed in, Victor and Clarissa were finally arrested, their web of lies and corruption exposed for the world to see. Leon, bruised but alive, watched as Isabella stood before her parents, tears streaming down her face. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "How could you do this?" But Victor and Clarissa only glared at her, unrepentant, even as they were led away in handcuffs. Leon and Isabella embraced, their hearts heavy but relieved. They had confronted the darkness and come out stronger on the other side, ready to begin a new chapter together, no matter what the future held. The night Victor and Clarissa Harrington were arrested felt like a blur to Isabella. She stood frozen in the rain-soaked street, watching the flashing red and blue lights as the police loaded her parents into the back of their cruiser. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a deep, hollow ache spread through her body, numbing her to everything else around her. It didn't seem real. How could it? The people who had raised her, who had taught her to be kind, who had given her every advantage in life, were criminals of the worst kind. Leon, equally battered and exhausted from the ordeal, stood by her side, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. Despite everything he had been through, the threats, the violence, the near-death experience, his only concern was Isabella. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice rough but full of warmth. Isabella shook her head, unable to form words. She felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sadness that threatened to consume her. "No," she whispered finally, "I'm not okay." She pulled away from him, pacing in circles on the wet pavement, her hands clutching at her hair. "How could they do this, Leon? How could they? They were my parents. I loved them. I trusted them." Leon took a step toward her, unsure of how to comfort her. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people aren't who we think they are. Sometimes they hide parts of themselves so deeply that even the ones closest to them can't see the truth." He wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known, but he could see that she needed to work through this on her own terms. Over the next few days, Isabella struggled to reconcile the reality of her parents' actions with the loving memories she had of them. She spent hours poring over old family albums, staring at pictures of birthdays, vacations, and holidays, searching for some sign, some hint that might have foreshadowed the darkness lurking beneath the surface. But there was nothing. Her parents had always been so careful, so calculated. They had never allowed their secrets to slip, not even once. It made the betrayal cut even deeper, knowing how skillfully they had hidden their true selves from her. The media frenzy that followed the arrests only made things worse. News outlets plastered the Harringtons' faces across every headline, dissecting every detail of their criminal empire. Reporters hounded Isabella, camping outside her apartment, shouting questions at her whenever she tried to leave. They wanted to know how she felt, if she had known, what she would do now. Each question was a knife twist, reminding her of her parents' heinous actions and the destruction they had left in their wake. Isabella tried to avoid the news, but it was impossible. Every time she turned on the TV or scrolled through her phone, there it was, the story of how the mighty Harringtons had fallen. It was as if the world reveled in their downfall, and every detail dragged Isabella deeper into despair. Even though she had done the right thing by turning them in, she felt complicit, tainted by association. How could she have been so blind? How could she not have seen what was happening right under her nose? Leon watched Isabella unravel, feeling powerless to help. He tried to be there for her as much as he could, offering support, a shoulder to cry on, or simply his presence whenever she needed it. But there were days when she would push him away, shutting herself off in her apartment for hours on end, refusing to speak to anyone. It broke his heart to see her like this, but he knew that this was something she had to confront on her own terms. One evening, after another grueling day of dealing with reporters and legal matters, Isabella found herself at the mansion she had grown up in. It stood empty now, the opulent rooms stripped of their warmth, echoing with the memories of a family that no longer existed. She wandered through the hallways, running her fingers along the walls, feeling the cool marble beneath her skin. Everything seemed so hollow, so lifeless, as if the house itself had turned against her. She ended up in her father's study, the place where Leon had first discovered the incriminating documents. Isabella stood there, staring at the desk where her father used to sit, and all the anger, the pain, the confusion came rushing back. She grabbed a vase from the mantelpiece and hurled it across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. Then she threw a picture frame, a lamp, anything she could get her hands on, until the room was a chaotic mess of broken glass and scattered papers. She fell to her knees amidst the wreckage, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. It was in that moment, as she knelt among the debris of her former life, that she felt a presence behind her. Leon had followed her, unable to leave her alone with her pain any longer. He stood in the doorway, watching her, his heart aching for her. "Isabella," he said softly, stepping over the shattered pieces to kneel beside her. "You don't have to go through this alone." She turned to him, her eyes red and swollen, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to lean into him, to let him hold her as she cried. "I feel so lost, Leon," she confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie." Leon pulled her closer, his hand gently stroking her hair. "You're not defined by what they did," he murmured. "You're strong, kind, and brave. You chose to stand up for what was right, even when it meant losing everything. That's who you are, Isabella. That's the person I fell in love with." As she listened to his words, Isabella felt a small flicker of hope stir within her. Maybe he was right. Maybe she wasn't defined by her parents' sins. But even as she clung to that hope, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be questions, judgment, and doubt, both from others and within herself. But for the first time since that terrible night, she felt the faintest glimmer of strength, and it was enough to push her forward. The next few weeks were a blur of court hearings, media scrutiny, and soul-searching. Isabella attended every court session, standing in the back of the courtroom as her parents' crimes were laid bare for all to see. Each new revelation was like a punch to the gut, but she refused to turn away. She needed to see it through, to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. Victor and Clarissa, once so proud and untouchable, now sat in the defendant's chair, stripped of their power and influence. They refused to meet Isabella's eyes, and she didn't know if it was out of shame or defiance. There was one moment, however, when Victor looked up and their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Isabella saw something in his gaze, a flicker of regret, of sorrow. But then he looked away, and whatever emotion had been there vanished, leaving only the hardened, unrepentant man she barely recognized. When the verdict was finally delivered, guilty on all counts, Isabella felt a strange sense of relief mixed with sorrow. Justice had been served, but at a cost. Her parents would spend the rest of their lives in prison, and she would have to live with the knowledge of their crimes. Yet, as she stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters shouting questions at her, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her. Leon was there, waiting for her as always, and she walked toward him, her steps steady and sure. "It's over," she said, her voice tinged with a bittersweet finality. He nodded, taking her hand in his, and together they walked away, leaving the past behind them. In the days that followed, Isabella made a vow to herself. She would not let her parents' actions define her. She would use their downfall as a catalyst for change, dedicating herself to helping those who had been hurt, just as they had hurt others. It was a path that would be long and difficult, but she knew that with Leon by her side, she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And so, step by step, Isabella began to rebuild her life. Not as the daughter of Victor and Clarissa Harrington, but as herself, a woman who had faced darkness and emerged stronger on the other side. In the aftermath of her parents' conviction, Isabella felt as though she was learning to walk again. The path ahead was uncharted, filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in her life, she was determined to find her own way. The mansion where she grew up, now cold and devoid of its former grandeur, had been seized as part of the legal proceedings. Everything she had known was gone: the lavish lifestyle, the societal privileges, the false sense of security. It was a strange liberation, like shedding a skin that had never truly fit. Isabella and Leon decided to leave the city, seeking refuge in a small, picturesque town by the coast, where the air was fresh and the people seemed kinder. They moved into a modest but charming cottage, a far cry from the opulence Isabella was accustomed to. At first, the simplicity of their new life was jarring. The rooms were smaller, the furnishings were second-hand, and the walls creaked with age. But slowly, Isabella began to find comfort in the imperfections. There was a warmth to the cottage, a sense of authenticity that the mansion had never possessed. Leon continued to be her rock, the anchor that kept her steady in the turbulent waters of her emotions. He had found a small office space in town where he could manage his investments and philanthropic projects remotely, but he spent most of his time with Isabella, helping her rebuild her life piece by piece. Together, they painted the walls of their cottage, planted a garden, and spent long evenings cooking dinner side by side, finding solace in the simple act of being together. One morning, as Isabella was tending to the flowers they had planted, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the stress of the past few months, but the feeling persisted. When it happened again the next day, Leon insisted they visit a doctor. Isabella reluctantly agreed, more to ease his worry than out of genuine concern. The doctor conducted a series of tests, and as they waited for the results, Isabella found herself bracing for the worst. After everything she had been through, she wasn't sure she could handle another blow. When the doctor finally walked into the room, smiling warmly, Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. "Congratulations," he said. "You're pregnant." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Isabella couldn't process them. Pregnant. She looked at Leon, who was staring at her with wide eyes, a grin slowly spreading across his face. "We're going to have a baby," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and joy. Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes as she placed her hand on her stomach, a million emotions flooding through her. It was as if life was giving her a chance to start over, to create something beautiful out of all the pain and suffering she had endured. For the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely happy, a lightness spreading through her chest that chased away the lingering shadows of her past. As the months passed, Isabella and Leon settled into their new roles, preparing for the arrival of their child. They spent hours painting the nursery, arguing playfully over the best colors, and poring over baby name books. Each step brought them closer together, and with every day that passed, Isabella felt the wounds left by her parents' betrayal slowly begin to heal. She found herself laughing more, dreaming more, and looking forward to a future that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. But even as she moved forward, there was a part of Isabella that couldn't let go of the past. She knew she couldn't change what her parents had done, but she felt a deep-seated need to make amends in some way. One evening, as she sat on the porch with Leon, the soft sounds of the ocean in the distance, she turned to him with a resolute look in her eyes. "I want to do something," she said, her voice steady. "I want to help the people my parents hurt." Leon nodded, having sensed this decision building within her for some time. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "I've been researching organizations that work with human trafficking survivors," Isabella replied, "and I want to start a foundation. something that provides not just financial support, but counseling, job training, and legal assistance. I want to help them rebuild their lives the way you've helped me rebuild mine." Leon's heart swelled with pride as he listened to her. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said, taking her hand in his. "And you won't be doing it alone. We'll do it together." Over the following months, Isabella threw herself into the project with a determination that surprised even her. She met with survivors, listened to their stories, and worked tirelessly to understand what they needed most. The foundation slowly took shape, and as word spread about her work, others began to take notice. Donations poured in, and soon the modest project grew into a powerful movement dedicated to empowering those who had been silenced for too long. Despite her newfound purpose, there were moments when Isabella felt the weight of her parents' actions pressing down on her. It happened one afternoon when she was visiting a shelter for survivors. As she spoke to a young woman who had escaped trafficking, the girl looked at Isabella with wide, fearful eyes and asked, "Why are you helping us? Aren't you one of them?" The question hit Isabella like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, she felt as though she couldn't breathe. Taking a deep breath, she knelt down in front of the girl, looking her in the eye. "I understand why you might think that," she said softly, "and you have every right to be angry. But I want you to know that I'm not my parents. I'm doing this because I believe in you, and I want to help you find your own path, just like I'm trying to find mine." The girl stared at her for a long moment before nodding, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she whispered, and in that moment, Isabella felt a small piece of herself begin to heal. As the foundation grew, so did the sense of peace that Isabella had longed for. She and Leon welcomed their baby, a beautiful little girl they named Lily, into the world one crisp autumn morning. As Isabella held her daughter for the first time, she felt an overwhelming rush of love and protectiveness. This tiny life represented everything she had fought for: hope, resilience, and the chance to build something good out of the ashes of her old life. In the months that followed, Isabella continued to work tirelessly, balancing her roles as a mother, a partner, and the head of her foundation. There were days when she felt exhausted, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she had taken on. But every time she looked at Lily, she found the strength to keep going. This was her chance to leave a legacy, to ensure that her daughter would grow up in a world that was just a little bit kinder, a little bit fairer. One evening, as Isabella sat by the fireplace, rocking Lily to sleep, Leon sat beside her, a look of quiet admiration on his face. "You've come so far," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've built something incredible." Isabella smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, reaching out to take his hand. "You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Leon kissed her gently, his heart full. "We did this together," he said, "and we'll keep doing it, one step at a time." As the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside their cottage, Isabella felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She had walked through the darkest moments of her life, faced unimaginable pain and betrayal, and emerged stronger. And now, with Leon by her side and Lily cradled in her arms, she was finally free to build the life she had always dreamed of. A life defined not by her parents' sins, but by her own choices, her own strength, and her own boundless capacity for love. As time passed, the foundation that Isabella had established continued to grow, becoming a beacon of hope for countless individuals whose lives had been shattered by trafficking and exploitation. What began as a small initiative evolved into a full-fledged organization with branches in several cities, employing specialists in trauma recovery, legal advocacy, job training, and education. Isabella's work was transforming lives, and the impact of her efforts could be seen in the faces of those who found solace, strength, and the courage to rebuild their futures. But the journey was far from easy. There were countless hurdles along the way: bureaucratic red tape, funding challenges, and the haunting stigma attached to her family name. Many still whispered about the Harrington scandal, and some donors hesitated to support a cause associated with the daughter of two notorious criminals. Isabella faced criticism and skepticism at every turn, but she never allowed it to deter her. She knew what she was fighting for, and more importantly, she knew that she was not alone. Leon stood by her side through every setback and every victory, his unwavering belief in her providing the strength she needed to keep pushing forward. He became deeply involved in the Foundation's work as well, using his financial expertise and connections to secure partnerships and grants that enabled them to expand their reach even further. Together, they hosted fundraisers, charity galas, and awareness campaigns, using their platform to shine a light on issues that society often preferred to ignore. One night, as they sat together after an especially successful gala, Isabella looked around the room, taking in the smiling faces, the laughter, and the sense of camaraderie that filled the space. It was a stark contrast to the superficial charity events of her past, where wealth and status took precedence over genuine compassion. "This is what I've always wanted," she said softly, her eyes shining. "To be part of something real, something that truly makes a difference." Leon squeezed her hand, a warm smile tugging at his lips. "You've done more than that, Isabella. You've changed lives, and you've changed mine." Their journey together had not only strengthened their bond, but had also allowed them to discover new facets of themselves. Isabella had found a sense of purpose that transcended her pain, and Leon had discovered the fulfillment that came from using his resources to help others. They had grown not just as individuals, but as partners, learning to support and uplift each other through every challenge. The Foundation's growth attracted the attention of various media outlets, and soon Isabella was invited to speak at conferences and interviews, sharing her story and advocating for policy changes that would protect vulnerable populations. Initially, the idea of public speaking terrified her. She was still haunted by the shadows of her parents' actions, and there were times when she feared that people would only ever see her as their daughter, tainted by association. But every time she stood in front of a microphone, she reminded herself that her voice mattered, that she was speaking not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced. Her speeches were passionate, raw, and unflinchingly honest. She didn't shy away from addressing her family's crimes or the guilt she felt for not realizing the truth sooner. Instead, she used her story as a testament to the power of change, to the idea that one's past does not have to dictate their future. Audiences responded to her authenticity, and she quickly became a prominent advocate for human rights, her voice carrying weight in circles that had once dismissed her. Despite her growing influence, Isabella never forgot the people she was fighting for. She continued to visit shelters and rehabilitation centers, spending time with survivors, listening to their stories, and offering them the support and empathy that had once been denied to them. It was during one of these visits that she met a young woman named Maria, whose story mirrored so much of what Isabella had fought against. Maria had been trafficked at a young age and had spent years in captivity before finally escaping. She was quiet, withdrawn, and wary of strangers, but as Isabella spoke with her, a spark of recognition passed between them. "I know who you are," Maria said one afternoon, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You're the daughter of the Harringtons, the ones who—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pang of guilt. "Yes," she replied softly. "But I'm not my parents, Maria. I'm trying to make things right, to help people like you find a way to heal." Maria looked at her for a long moment, her eyes searching. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why do you care?" "Because I know what it's like to feel powerless," Isabella answered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know what it's like to be betrayed by the people who are supposed to protect you. And I want to make sure that no one else ever has to go through that." For the first time, Maria's expression softened and she nodded. It was a small gesture, but to Isabella, it meant everything. It was proof that her efforts were making a difference, that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark a light in the darkest of places. Months turned into years, and Isabella's foundation continued to flourish. It wasn't just a source of support for survivors, it became a force for systemic change. Laws were amended, awareness campaigns reached new heights, and countless lives were transformed by the work she and Leon had started. They began to collaborate with international organizations, extending their reach beyond their country's borders, ensuring that their message of hope and resilience reached those who needed it most. The couple's dedication did not go unnoticed. They were invited to speak at the United Nations, where Isabella delivered a powerful address on the need for global cooperation in combating human trafficking. She stood on that stage, looking out at a sea of diplomats, activists, and leaders, and felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had brought her to this moment, a moment where her voice could echo across the world, amplifying the stories of those who had been silenced for far too long. As Isabella concluded her speech, the audience rose to their feet, offering a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. Tears filled her eyes as she took in the sight, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. She wasn't just the daughter of Victor and Clarissa Harrington. She was Isabella, a woman who had found the strength to forge her own path, to create a legacy defined not by her parents' sins, but by her own courage and compassion. After the event, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel, overlooking the glittering city below, Leon wrapped his arms around Isabella, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You've changed the world." Isabella leaned back against him, a smile playing at her lips. "No," she replied. "We did it." In the years that followed, Isabella and Leon continued their work, expanding their foundation, raising their daughter Lily, and building a life that was rich not in wealth, but in love, purpose, and the profound sense of fulfillment that came from helping others. They became known not as the disgraced daughter of the Harringtons and her wealthy fiancé, but as a couple who had dedicated their lives to making the world a better place. Their story was shared in documentaries, written about in books, and taught in universities as an example of resilience, redemption, and the power of one person's determination to create change. And as they stood together at the Foundation's 10-year anniversary gala, watching survivors take the stage to share their stories, Isabella felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. These were the moments that defined her now. Not the pain, not the betrayal, but the strength, the hope, and the undeniable proof that even in the face of darkness, light could always find a way to shine through. At the end of the night, as the guests departed and the ballroom emptied, Isabella and Leon remained, standing in the glow of the chandelier, holding each other close. "This is just the beginning," Leon whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Isabella nodded, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Yes," she agreed, "just the beginning." The 10th anniversary gala of Isabella and Leon's foundation was more than just an event. It was a testament to how far they had come and how much they had achieved together. It was a night filled with hope, celebration, and stories of resilience. The ballroom was adorned with lights that twinkled like stars, casting a warm, inviting glow over the guests who had gathered from all corners of the world. Survivors, activists, government officials, and philanthropists mingled, exchanging stories and forming connections that would further the cause Isabella had devoted her life to. As Isabella stood on the stage, gazing out at the audience, she felt a swell of pride. This was the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and a relentless commitment to creating change. She watched as survivors, once silenced and broken, now walked confidently around the room, sharing their stories and inspiring others with their courage. It was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place: to give a voice to those who had been stripped of theirs, to provide a platform for healing and empowerment. When it was time for Isabella to speak, the room fell into a hushed silence. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her journey pressing on her shoulders, but instead of burdening her, it lifted her, grounding her in the moment. 10 years ago, she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I stood in a very different place. I was lost, broken, and searching for meaning in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. I didn't know if I would ever find my way back. But then something miraculous happened. I found strength in the very people I set out to help. I found hope in their resilience, their courage, and their unwavering belief that they could overcome even the darkest of circumstances. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of several survivors who had become like family to her over the years. This foundation, she continued, was never about me. It was about you. Each and every one of you who refused to be defined by your past, who chose to fight for a better future. You are the heroes of this story. And tonight, we celebrate you. The room erupted in applause, and Isabella felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. It was a moment of validation, not just for her, but for everyone who had walked this path with her. As the applause died down, she continued, her voice growing stronger. But our work is far from over. There are still so many out there who need our help, who need to know that they are not alone. And I promise you, as long as there is breath in my body, I will continue to fight for them, just as I have fought for you. When she finished speaking, the audience rose to their feet, giving her a standing ovation that seemed to echo through the hall. Isabella stepped back, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride, and Leon joined her on the stage, taking her hand. He leaned in and whispered, "You were amazing." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "We were amazing," she corrected. Together, they bowed to the audience, and as they stepped off the stage, Isabella felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This was her legacy, a legacy built not on wealth or power, but on love, compassion, and an unyielding belief in the goodness of humanity. After the gala, Leon and Isabella stood outside on the terrace, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. The night was cool, and a gentle breeze ruffled Isabella's hair as she leaned against Leon, savoring the quiet moment they had stolen for themselves. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked softly. "All the time," Leon replied, wrapping his arms around her. "It's incredible, isn't it? How something that began in pain and darkness has led to so much light." Isabella nodded, resting her head against his chest. "I used to think that my parents' actions would define me forever," she confessed. "That I would always be seen as their daughter, as someone who was tainted by their crimes. But now I realize that I've created my own story, one that is separate from theirs." "You have," Leon agreed, his voice gentle but firm. "You've built something beautiful, Isabella. Something that will outlast all of us." They stood there for a long time, just holding each other, allowing the weight of the years to slip away. It was in these quiet moments that Isabella felt most at peace, most connected to herself and the life she had worked so hard to create. She thought about their daughter, Lily, now a bright and spirited 10-year-old who was growing up surrounded by love, compassion, and the values that Isabella and Leon had worked so hard to instill in her. Lily had inherited her mother's fierce determination and her father's quiet strength. She often accompanied them to events and meetings, her eyes wide with curiosity and wonder as she listened to the stories of survivors who had found their way back from the brink. It was clear that she was already beginning to understand the importance of the work her parents were doing, and Isabella felt a surge of pride every time she saw her daughter speak with kindness and empathy to someone who had suffered. One afternoon, a few weeks after the gala, Lily approached her mother with a question that took Isabella by surprise. "Mom," she said, her brow furrowed in thought, "why do you help people who were hurt by bad things, even if they're strangers?" Isabella knelt down, taking her daughter's hands in her own. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be happy, Lily," she explained. "No matter what they've been through or where they come from. We help because it's the right thing to do. Because it's how we make the world a better place." Lily seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding, her face lighting up with a smile. "Then I want to help too," she declared, and in that moment, Isabella knew that her daughter would carry on the legacy they had worked so hard to build. As the years continued to pass, Isabella and Leon's foundation expanded its reach, touching the lives of thousands across the globe. They partnered with governments, international organizations, and grassroots movements, advocating for policies that protected the vulnerable and held perpetrators accountable. Their work led to significant changes in legislation, with stricter laws being passed to combat human trafficking and exploitation. They were invited to speak at international summits, their voices becoming a powerful force for change in a world that was finally beginning to wake up to the horrors that had been hidden for so long. But despite their growing influence, Isabella and Leon never lost sight of the people they were fighting for. They continued to visit shelters, speak with survivors, and mentor young activists who were eager to make a difference. Every success, every life saved, was a reminder of why they had started this journey, and they remained grounded in their commitment to creating a world where everyone could live free from fear and suffering. One day, as they stood in front of a new center they had opened in a small village that had been ravaged by trafficking, Isabella felt a sense of pride that went beyond words. This center would provide education, counseling, and job training, giving survivors the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. It was a dream that she had carried with her since the early days of the foundation, and now, as she watched the first group of survivors walk through the doors, she knew that her dream had become a reality. Leon stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, and they watched in silence as the survivors began to explore their new home. "We did it," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. Isabella turned to him, her eyes shining. "Yes," she replied, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "We did." In that moment, she realized that their legacy was not just the foundation they had built or the lives they had changed. It was the love they had shared, the strength they had found in each other, and the hope they had given to a world that had once seemed so dark. They had proven that even the most broken hearts could be healed, that even the most painful pasts could be transformed into something beautiful. And as they stood there, hand in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Isabella knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. There were still battles to fight, still lives to save, but she no longer faced them with fear or doubt. For she had found her purpose, her voice, and her place in the world, not as the daughter of Victor and Clarissa Harrington, but as Isabella, a woman who had chosen love, compassion, and courage above all else. And in the end, that was the legacy that would endure, a legacy of hope, of healing, and of the unshakable belief that even the smallest act of kindness could change the world.